With great joy, please rise in body or in spirit and join in our opening call to worship. Let us worship God, our light and our salvation. We have come with shouts of joy to sing and to make music to the Lord. Would you join me in a...
The epistle reading is Hebrews chapter 11, beginning with the 29th verse. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I don't know if any of you here might remember Lillian Humphreys. She was a member of our church, died a few years back, had lived into her 90s. She was a painter, great literary, she was amazing, really adored her. And the last time I visited with her before she died, she was in the nursing home and there was a window next to her bed, and she looked out the window for a moment. I'll never forget, she said, "People are insufficiently attentive to clouds," which is probably correct. People are insufficiently attentive to clouds. The writer of Hebrews talks about a cloud. He said the cloud of witnesses. He has a roll call of the great saints who have gone before us, all those Old Testament heroes, Daniel and David and Samson, and he goes on and on. And what I love is, as he's rattling off the stories of these in verse 32, he says, "Time will fail me if I try to cover them all." He's a writer of a biblical book, and he's worried about taking too much time. Time will fail me. It reminds me of the scene in the movie Sleepless in Seattle. The story about a little boy, his mother has died. His dad, Sam's, not doing very well, so Jonah decides to help his dad by phoning in to this radiotherapist named Dr. Marcia Fieldstone, and gets his dad on the phone. Well, his dad doesn't really want to talk to Dr. Marcia Fieldstone, but he's stuck. And so Marcia's trying to talk to him, and she asked the question, "What was so special about your wife?" And his response was, "Well, how long is your program? How long is your program?" The writer of Hebrews is doing this, like, how much time do you have? I can tell you the great things of God's people over time. Gideon, it's wonderful. And what struck me this week, though, in preparing to talk about this is what the writer says in verse 34. He says, "They grew powerful out of weakness." They grew powerful out of weakness. And Reverend Nancy Watson dazzled me this week with her Greek scholarship, pointing out to me what I had skated right past, is that the Greek verb that's used there is a passive verb. It doesn't really mean they became strong out of their weakness. It means they were made strong in their weakness, a la by God. We think that so often it's like it's up to us, we got to make things happen, but this story of the cloud of witnesses in Hebrews is about things that God has done in people, through people. This drove me back to thinking about Brené Brown. A lot of people love Brené Brown, follow her, see her talks, read her books, and so on. She really got her start. She kind of went viral when she had given this TED Talk, and it was published on the Huffington Post, and she made a mistake, which is she looked at the reader comments. Now, I've been in the Huffington Post a few times, and it's a bad idea to read the reader comments, because the one thing you learn from the reader comments is that people have too much time on their hands and too much nastiness in their heads. But she did this, and she thought her TED Talk was pretty good, but then she read the reader's comments. They said things like, because her talk was on embracing imperfection. First comment was, of course she embraces imperfection, it's all she's got. Or, she's a researcher, said she should do less research and use more Botox. Maybe she'll be worthy after she drops 20 pounds, and on and on. Well, this got her really depressed, and so she thought there's nothing else to do except to go home and binge watch Downton Abbey, which she did, and when that ended, she didn't feel any better, so she's just messing around on the computer, really in a funk, and she decided to Google what was going on in the United States during the time period of Downton Abbey in England, and she came across a quote from President Teddy Roosevelt that goes like this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. No, the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and who comes up short again and again, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst knows that if he fails, at least he failed while daring greatly." That's pretty good. You see, what Brene Brown talks about is our need for connection. God made us where we need deep connection with other people, and the fact is we're no good at it. We connect with people. We don't connect deeply with people. We connect superficially with people. This happened to me last night, by the way. Lisa and I moved to Plaza Midwood a year ago. My next door neighbor, he's kind of the mayor of Plaza Midwood. He has a big party every year in August. We went to the party, and there must have been 200 people there. And this is really interesting, because I talked to quite a number of them, and as best I could tell, every one of them is doing fabulously. And they've had a giddy, marvelous summer, and work is great, and their home is great, and they were amazing people. And what struck me about it, though, was because of what had happened to me on Thursday of this week. Now, you know this. I send out these text messages. Some of you get them, you read them. I try to, poke you during the weeks. You'll think about God, something hopefully a little inspirational. Once in a while, though, I'll do this thing where I'll send out a text and it'll just say, "How can I pray for you today?" And I get a gazillion responses. On Thursday this week, I sent one out. I was thinking of Brene Brown. I said, "How would you answer Brene Brown's question, which is, when do you feel vulnerable?" On the first minute, I had 100 text responses. By lunch, I had 1,000. And these are from the people that are doing great. And let me read to you some of what they shared with me. A lot of it had to do with aging and my body breaking down. I had a young parent say, "I'm afraid I won't be there when my kids are grown." All kinds of feel vulnerable about that. Some people said I feel vulnerable because I have these intrusive, dark thoughts. I can't get rid of them. They keep me awake at night. Some said feelings of rejection. How do I move into the future when my marriage just ended? I feel vulnerable when I feel left behind. I feel vulnerable that I don't have enough. I feel vulnerable when thoughts creep into my head that I'm not enough. I feel vulnerable when we're struggling, but everybody we socialize with is doing great. I feel vulnerable because I don't know how to keep peace in my marriage. This being the week that it was, I heard from quite a number of parents saying things like, "My child is going off to kindergarten." I remember first time I did this with Sarah, she could care less that Dad was there. She was fine, but so I kind of set her in the hall and she kind of toddled away, and I had this premonition of more partings to come, and it just made my knees buckle. My knees did buckle. I heard from a lot of people this week. We're taking our child to college, right? People said to me things like, "I'm dropping my daughter off at college and I can't shelter her. I can't help her." I don't want to take Sarah to college. I mean, it should have been such a happy moment. We drop her off at the dorm at Duke, and it should just be a great moment. I kept it together in front of her, and then we left the building, and I just couldn't breathe. I cried that night. I cried the next night, and I wasn't, in retrospect, I don't think I was afraid she wouldn't be okay. I wasn't sure, that I would be okay. people shared with me things on Thursday like, I feel really vulnerable when I need to ask for help. And some said I need to ask for help, but I don't. And quite a few said, I feel vulnerable because I fear opening up to other people. Now, what struck me about all of this is that church ought to be the place where we open up to other people. Church ought to be the place you ask for help. What did Frederick Buechner say, the clenched fists? He said, we live our lives like clenched fists. Clenched fists can do a lot of things. It can work, and it can fight, and it can hang on to things. He said, but what the clenched fist can't do is it can never accept a helping hand. God knows we need a helping hand. All this brokenness. Last Sunday, I was so struck. This amazing, it should be nothing, but it was an amazing thing. After the 8:30 service, kind of milling around in here, and a guy that I know, not real well, but he walked up to me out in the aisle there, and you know what he said to me? He said, James, I just want you to know that I love you. I was really grateful. And it occurred to me how rarely that happens. I don't mean how rarely you say, James, I love you, but just how rarely, like in church, we even say stuff like that, when maybe that ought to be the norm. We ought to just be overflowing with words of love for one. And like, why don't we do that? Like, guys don't say, I love you to a guy. Or, silly, right? So I was moved. He took a chance by doing that, right? He made himself vulnerable, but then enabled me to say, I love you too. Thank you. It was great. Later that morning, a parent shared with me that she has a grown child who's going through some really tough struggles right now. And I was weirdly delighted, it's not the right word, as a parent who myself has a daughter who's going through some really tough struggles right now. Do you see how that works? If everybody's always doing great, then you feel kind of trapped and isolated and dark in your struggles, but actually other people are struggling. If you take the chance and share your struggles, somebody else feels loved. I mean, when Hebrews rattles off this cloud of witnesses, the great things, it's not like everybody was doing great. Samson had burnout. Abel was abused by his brother. Moses was abandoned. I mean, all this stuff. The premise of moving toward healing, toward connection that Brene Brown rightly says we need, is when you become vulnerable. If you go to AA, you don't say, I'm doing great with alcohol now. No, you say, I'm broken. You go to the therapist. You don't walk in the therapist and say, everything's great. No, you tell your brokenness, and then you're kind of on the way to something, but you're not on the way until you tell your brokenness. Bill Roth said this to me this week. He said, maybe our weakness is our superpower. I'd love to ask you, do you have a superpower? Yeah. Bill says, maybe our weakness is our superpower. I was interviewed recently by somebody that were writing an article about ministry. And the person began by saying, you've been a really successful minister. You've had a great ministry. What are your secrets? What do you chalk it up to that you've done so well? And I started to say, I didn't know what I was going to say. I thought, I'll say, I don't know. I have a good brain. I think I do have a pretty good brain. And I work really hard. And I can say, I have a good brain and I work hard. That's why, but that's nonsense. If I've done any good as a minister, it is 100% because I know that I am broken. I know that I am wounded. I know the darkness. And if I know the darkness, I can love you in your darkness. As best I can tell, if we think about what's wrong in the world, what do we do about what's wrong in the world? We don't turn to vulnerability enough, do we? Like try to elect the politician who says, I'm vulnerable. That'd be great, right? So what politicians do, right, is they get louder and louder and more shrill, and they're tough, and they do their fists a lot. You know, this is very impressive. We fawn over candidates like that. Who's the toughest? Who's the toughest? But as best I can tell, real change just only happens when people become vulnerable and take chances and are willing to lose everything. I thought about, we're doing this Deep South pilgrimage, so you ought to come with us on this. It's going to be great. We're going to go to Atlanta, Montgomery, civil rights places. In Montgomery, they have an exhibit there dedicated to Rosa Parks. I actually have a bus. You can get on this bus. It's a replica of her. So what Rosa Parks, this is so interesting. Rosa Parks, how did she become famous? She didn't get a gun and shoot people. She didn't beat the daylights out of white people in Montgomery, Alabama. No, she was just a short little wisp of a thing, a Methodist seamstress. And what she did is she just took a seat and didn't get up. And you have to know that in those days, if you did that, somebody could yank you off that bus and beat the living daylights out of you, and nobody would ask a question. But she kept her seat. The world's different. That guy in Tiananmen Square, right? They don't even know his name. They can't figure out who the guy was that did it. They have this tank. You remember this scene? And he stands out there in front of a tank. This is a bad idea because that tank could have mowed him down and nobody would have asked a question. But instead, he just stood there and the tank stopped. St. Francis of Assisi went off to the Crusades. The Christians were putting on their armor and marching off, and they had their catapults, and then they were against the Saracens who were wielding their sabers, and just so much bloodshed. And St. Francis walked across no man's land unarmed, barefooted, kind of a laughing stock. And they pulled their sabers to kill him, but he was so pitiful. He was kind of a novelty, so they took him to the Sultan Malik al-Kamil, and they spent 3 days together and became friends. And Francis bought some peace in the Middle East for a little while. Greg Boyle, if you heard him the other week, he said this amazing thing. He was telling the story of Mario. Greg Boyle works with gang members in Los Angeles. He has a tremendous ministry. It sounds hard, but he's full of so much joy. He told the story about Mario. He said Mario was a gang leader. He said when he came into the program, he was the most tattooed person ever to come into that program. And so that's saying a lot because they're all pretty tattooed. But Mario came in, and he went from being this ferocious gang leader to being the one that when people in the program would say, who's the gentlest person here? People would say, oh, Mario. Mario. Greg Boyle said that Mario is proof that the highest form of spiritual maturity is tenderness. We get this wrong, don't we? Some people think spiritual maturity is when you know what's wrong with other people. But when we do this, we forget what Paul said. Paul said there is no condemnation in Christ Jesus. God asks us to be tender. I went downtown yesterday. I always love when something's going on in the city. I try to go down and just see people, see what's going on. I went down yesterday, and they're having this Pride event. And I don't get to talk to total strangers about church very often, but I knew I could there. So I wore a t-shirt that identified me as a clergy person. I had so many interesting, heartbreaking conversations. One guy said to me, I used to love church. I used to pray, but I don't pray anymore. I don't go to church anymore. Another guy said, I'm gay, you're a pastor. What are you doing here? He said, you guys hate us. So we don't hate you. Christians don't hate people. We're called to be tender. We're called to be vulnerable. I'll close with this. I know I'm talking too long. Let me just finish with this. The text in Hebrews 11, it talks about all these people that did all these things. And one, it refers to those who received promises. They received promises. Like, what is that? So I thought that reminded me a few years back, this terrible book came out. It's got some good stuff in it, but it's called The Prayer of Jabez. It's by this guy named Wilkinson. It's got some good stuff in it, but it's got this one passage that just makes your head hurt. So what he says is, God's got blessings for you, and you don't have them because you haven't gone for them. So what you need to do is you need to back your station wagon up to God's warehouse, and God's got boxes in there with your name on them, and just load them in your car and take them home. And I bet a lot of people read that and thought, oh man, God's got blessings for me. Where is this warehouse, though? I wondered, and at the time I responded to it by saying, there's a warehouse and God's got boxes with your name on it, but if you back your station wagon up there, what you're going to find out is you open the first box and there's a cross. You open the next box, there's sacrifice in there. What I want to say this week, though, is this. If you back your station wagon up and load up with those boxes and you get them home, I think here's the way it goes, is you open the first box and there's somebody in there. And it's Jesus himself. And he stands up in the box and he looks you in the eye and he calls you by name and he embraces you. You open another box and there's just a message in it. And it says, you are enough. And there's another box and the message is, you belong. And there's another box and the message is, you matter. You matter. Years back, I was visiting a church woman who was dying. She was really sick. I adored her. She was quirky, so interesting. And so I was talking to her, and I said my prayer at the end, and I looked down, and I realized she had tears on her cheek. And so, trying to comfort her, what I did, I bent down, and I guess my cheek brushed her cheek, because then when I rose up, some of her tears were on my face, right? And she looked up and she said, "Oh, you're crying." She took her tissue and she wiped her tears from my face. And I thought, that's church. That's spiritual maturity. We share tears. And tears are interesting. You think about what's a cloud. Lillian said, look at the cloud. What's a cloud? A cloud, it looks like a big solid thing up there. Sometimes it's black and threatening and ominous or whatever. What a cloud is, if you get up close, it's just a lot of little tiny drops of water. So the thing about the tears of God's people, they're like so many drops of water, and what God's cloud is just all of those tears gathered together. And the amazing thing, all those tears, when they're together, they make a cloud, and the cloud is such a beautiful thing. And the cloud is especially beautiful. I mean, you have to own it. The cloud is especially beautiful at the end of the day. It's the color. So lovely. Lillian was right. People are insufficiently attentive to clouds.